In Willow Creek, mornings once began with the quiet hum of sprinklers and the faint rustle of oak leaves lining the cul-de-sac. Every driveway held a familiar car, a sign of steady lives and predictable routines. The community prided itself on order, with the HOA's neatly phrased newsletters promising tranquility and fairness. But tranquility, as the residents would soon discover, bore conditions. Parking had always been a topic of mild irritation, whispered about at barbecues and HOA gatherings. The streets, narrow and picturesque, weren't built for the growing number of vehicles each household accumulated over time. Families with teenagers acquired used cars, couples bought new SUVs, and suddenly the limited parallel parking began to vanish overnight. When frustration reached the board, it was cloaked in polite language and administrative precision. To preserve the character of the neighborhood, they said, a parking policy is essential. What emerged from those board discussions was a document, 8 pages, single-spaced, detailing new regulations that would redefine daily life in Willow Creek. Each home was permitted 2 cars, no exceptions. Guest vehicles could not remain past sunset. Any violation, they said, would result in administrative towing at the owner's expense. It sounded procedural, almost harmless, until the first truck appeared. The towing company contracted by the HOA rolled into the neighborhood like a silent predator. Its matte black truck moved at dawn, its operator with a clipboard and camera, snapping photos under the dim glow of porch lights. By breakfast, the neighborhood had begun to wake to the sound of engines being hauled away, the morning symphony of metal chains and hydraulic whines. What started as a policy of order quickly turned punitive. Elderly residents returning late from family visits found their sedans missing. College kids on weekend home visits discovered fines that exceeded their monthly tuition payments. The board remained unmoved, citing non-compliance with established community authorization. Willow Creek began to fracture. Some residents accepted the rules as necessary. After all, order required sacrifice. Others viewed them as a siege against personal freedom. Conversations on driveways turned sharp, accusations flew in neighborhood Facebook groups, and the tone shifted from civility to rebellion. The center of the brewing unrest was the towing company's predatory efficiency. Its surveillance was relentless, its timing precise. Tow trucks appeared precisely 3 minutes past midnight. No warnings, no notifications. Rumors spread that certain board members had financial connections to the towing operator. Others claimed this crackdown was designed to thin the community of less desirable residents, the renters, the young families, the people who had only recently joined Willow Creek. Whether truth or gossip, suspicion became the new neighbor. By the time the second week ended, 10 cars had been towed, and peace had evaporated entirely. Residents began to gather at the mail kiosk after dark, whispering over printed violation notices under flickering street lamps. Fists clenched, tempers rose, and the quiet streets of Willow Creek began to pulse with resentment. The HOA believed control had been restored. But underneath that manufactured calm, something had already shifted, a collective anger growing faster than they could imagine. And then came the first organized voice of resistance. By the third week, the phrase, parking freedom, began circulating among residents like a whispered rebellion. It appeared in group texts, scribbled on mailroom bulletin boards, and murmured between neighbors standing beside empty driveways. The first meeting happened quietly in the community park, under the cover of twilight. Dozens attended, bundled in evening jackets, standing around picnic tables lit by phone flashlights. The stories that spilled into that space were desperate and furious. Someone had lost their car because a visiting parent parked at 11:59 p.m. Another had received a $600 retrieval bill after returning late from an airport run. What shocked them most was the indifference of the HOA board. Emails went unanswered. Calls were deflected to automated recordings. Every attempt at dialogue was met with bureaucracy, a wall of phrasing that said, rules are rules, and nothing else. Outrage began evolving into strategy. A group of residents formed an informal coalition, later dubbed the Willow Creek Fair Parking Committee. It wasn't official, but it carried weight. Members analyzed the HOA charter line by line, searching for loopholes and flaws. The document's language revealed oversights. clauses granting power without necessary homeowner votes, ambiguous phrasing around enforcement, and no clear cap on fees charged by contracted services. This information became their weapon. Social media posts started appearing, carefully worded and backed by scanned pages of the charter. The evidence ignited fury, not just locally but across homeowner forums online. Willow Creek became a trending cautionary tale, a neighborhood gone too far in pursuit of order, pressure mounted. HOA board members found themselves cornered by cameras as residents recorded confrontations at community centers and driveways. One board representative resigned after receiving threats. Another retreated entirely from public view. The towing company, however, continued its nightly patrols. Their trucks didn't just take vehicles, they left careless damage behind. Scratched curbs, broken mailboxes, oil leaks staining manicured pavements. The neighborhood began to reflect the chaos brewing within. As the tension reached its peak, the coalition decided to escalate. Petitions were drafted demanding suspension of the parking policy and termination of the towing contract. Signatures flooded in within hours. More than 70% of homeowners endorsed the cause, a powerful majority. When the petition reached the HOA's desk, it was treated as defiance. Notices were sent out claiming unauthorized collective action, and the board threatened legal ramifications for instigating unrest. That only fueled the movement further. Residents pooled funds to hire a local attorney known for taking on HOA excesses. The legal team began documenting cases, cataloging unfair towing incidents, and preparing for what many feared, and others anticipated, a public court showdown. The HOA underestimated the persistence of its residents. Their own tactics had ignited something much larger than a parking dispute. What began as irritation had transformed into civil resistance within the confines of white picket fences. In the final week of that bitter month, a tow truck returned at dawn to remove a minivan belonging to one of the organizing families. The residents watched from their porches in silence. No one shouted. No one interfered. But something in that quiet collective gaze told the operator everything he needed to know. Willow Creek was ready for war. Weeks turned into months, and Willow Creek's rebellion matured into a formal battle. Lawsuits were filed under the coalition's name. Ordinary homeowners turned reluctant plaintiffs. Their attorney, a local litigator with a reputation for tackling overreaching HOAs, began building the case with precision. He gathered documents, towing receipts, and resident testimonies that painted a portrait of systemic abuse masked as rule enforcement. The argument was simple at its core. The HOA had exceeded its authority. While community bylaws granted the board power to establish regulations, they did not explicitly authorize punitive enforcement through private towing without prior homeowner consent. Nor had the board provided the mandated notification or hearing process before action was taken. Each towed vehicle represented a due process violation. In the months leading to the trial, the HOA's defenses began to falter. Internal emails surfaced, exposing private conversations between board members and the towing contractor, where profits from retrieved vehicles were discussed in terms disturbingly close to revenue sharing. These revelations shattered the facade of fair governance the board had maintained. As the case unfolded in the county courthouse, media attention followed. Local news outlets arrived, drawn by the spectacle of a neighborhood turned against itself. The court filings detailed emotional distress, financial harm, and threats disguised as homeowner compliance. Attorneys invoked precedents from similar HOA disputes across the country, cases where courts struck down overreaching enforcement tactics. When the day of testimony arrived, residents filled the courtroom gallery. One by one, they recounted their experiences: the sudden disappearance of vehicles, the humiliation of towing, the financial strain of impound fees. Elderly homeowners described walking miles home after discovering their cars gone. Families shared how they had missed work or school because of abrupt removals. The HOA board's representation tried to maintain composure, insisting that the rules were lawful under the community's covenants, conditions, and restrictions, CC and RS. They cited association case law that gave HOAs broad discretion to regulate parking within their domain. But under cross-examination, their defense began to unravel. The attorney for the residents emphasized the HOA's failure to comply with its own due process provisions and questioned the validity of rules enacted without a full membership vote, echoing challenges seen in similar disputes nationwide. When the towing company's manager was called to testify, the atmosphere thickened. Photos and financial records revealed that the company operated under minimal oversight, receiving weekly reports of potential violations from select board members who personally profited from every retrieval. The courtroom stirred when it was disclosed that several board officers had used proceeds from towing for HOA administrative improvements, including private events and catering bills. The turning point came when the plaintiff's attorney read aloud excerpts from an internal HOA memo discussing the deterrent value of visible tows, admitting that the goal was intimidation, not community function. That single document changed everything. The judge's patience waned as it became apparent that the HOA had weaponized its governance, transforming civic duty into coercion. As proceedings continued, community members outside the courthouse began gathering in daily demonstrations, quiet at first, then growing into a sea of signs demanding reform. Television crews captured the contrast. A neighborhood built for harmony now standing united against its own board to be why the close of arguments. It was clear the court's decision would carry far beyond Willow Creek. This was no longer merely about parking, it was about power, trust, and accountability in the faceless machinery of homeowners' governance. The final day of court arrived under gray skies. The residents of Willow Creek packed the room, the air thick with exhaustion and hope. When the judge entered, silence consumed the space. The verdict, read in steady measured tones, carried the weight of every grievance that had been spoken aloud. The court ruled decisively in favor of the residents. The HOA, the judge declared, had exceeded its governance authority by enforcing punitive towing without due process or member consent. The parking rules were voided for vagueness and procedural failure. Furthermore, the contract with the towing company was deemed exploitative and illegal in its enforcement practices. A hush followed, then quiet sobs of relief. Some residents clasped hands, others simply stared ahead, stunned. Months of tension melted into quiet vindication. The board was ordered to reimburse every towing fee collected during the enforcement period, pay legal fees, and suspend all contracts pending a full community vote. Outside the courthouse, cameras caught the moment jubilation spilled into the streets. Signs proclaiming parking freedom restored waved above smiling faces. It wasn't just about cars. It was about reclaiming dignity in a place that had turned cold with regulation. Within weeks, resignations rippled through the HOA board. Several members stepped down amid allegations of misconduct. A temporary committee was established, led by previously marginalized residents, the same ones whose cars had been first towed away. Their first act was to rewrite the HOA charter, embedding safeguards that ensured future policies would require transparent voting, oversight, and public accountability. The towing company vanished overnight. Its trucks no longer prowled the quiet cul-de-sacs, and for the first time in months, the residents could breathe freely. Slowly, the sound of chains and hydraulic lifts gave way to laughter once again. Driveways returned to normalcy, with vehicles parked naturally, practically, humanely. But even after victory, the scars of the conflict remained. Friendships had been lost to the tension. Neighbors who had sided with the board lingered in uneasy silence. The memory of betrayal lingered in the corners of every mailbox and the shadow of every board notice. Yet, the community endured, reshaped by the storm it had survived. As the months passed, Willow Creek emerged as both warning and inspiration. News stories labeled it the neighborhood that fought back, quoted in legal seminars and HOA reform discussions across the state. It became a precedent-setting example of collective resistance against overreach, the story of an ordinary community that chose defiance over compliance and reclaimed its right to fairness. To be why the next spring, lawns flourished again, children played in the same streets that had once echoed with the groan of tow trucks, and the sign at the neighborhood entrance, once chipped and faded, was repainted. At the bottom, a new line was added, community built on trust. Willow Creek had survived the perils of parking. And in doing so, it had found its soul once more.